Second Chances, Chapter 5.
David had been as curious about Area 51 as every other American with any imagination. Now, at last, he was part of this extraordinary place. It is an important project that would one day make it possible for humanity to explore the universe. David entered the lab, entered his password, placed his left eye near the scanner, and was admitted. Inside the lab, David saw a great computer complex. He recognized the Cray supercomputers and the associated peripherals as the newest, state-of-the-art computing power available to government and industry. The door opened as David pondered what he saw, and Dr. Jeffrey Franklin, director of Project Deep Silence, walked in.
"Well, my boy, how do you like our layout?"
The doctor asked in a friendly, enthusiastic tone. "Well, doctor, I must say, I am impressed. This stuff is the best in the industry."
But it is, and we are going to use every bit of computing power we have, and maybe more before we are through. Now, are you ready to begin your testing, my boy?
The "my boy" irritated David. But he could put up with it as long as things were friendly. And so, he began his testing schedule. David took what seemed to be placement tests in electronic engineering, physics, astrophysics, higher mathematics, and chemistry. Each test was 8 hours long. He would test for 2 hours, break for a few minutes, test for another 2 hours, lunch, and more testing, break, and more testing. David was sure that he had bombed the tests. But then, Dr. Franklin briefed him on the results of the tests.
"David, my boy, you did absolutely miserable on the tests. That's great."
He was a little taken aback. "What do you mean that's great, doctor?"
"This is what we are going to do, my boy. While you are in cryo sleep, we will be playing tapes of lectures on various subjects. We want to see if we can use the time your body is immobile to help you learn something new. We will also try to train you in all those martial arts you named. You know you can hear faster than a man can speak, so we will put you through a course approximately to a master's level in academics. Well, my boy, time for the doctors to go over you."
The Air Force doctors poked and prodded him as no other doctor had ever done: X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, echograms, and so on. The doctors put probes in every bodily opening he had. After 10 days of medical testing, the doctors pronounced him healthy as a horse. Which pleased Dr. Franklin no end. Before long, it was time for the first period of cryo sleep for David. Dr. Franklin told David they would try to train him in Taekwondo since the Air Force had an instructor assigned to Area 51. They would also try some elementary astrophysics. The test was, after all, only 2 days.
"We will begin at 5 a.m. tomorrow, my boy. Are you ready? We are going to try some elementary astrophysics. The test is, after all, only 2 days."
David smiled at the good doctor. "Does a bear sleep in the woods? I'm ready." 4 comes terribly early every morning. But for some reason, this morning, it was especially early. David fell off his bunk, rolled to a sitting position, and decided to shower before breakfast. While in the shower, Dr. Franklin entered his room.
"David, my boy, are you ready?"
"Doc, I will be out in a minute." "What's for breakfast?" Dr. Franklin shouted back.
"Nothing for you, my boy. You need an empty stomach for the cryo sleep."
David spent half an hour in the lab getting specific shots that were supposed to help the body withstand the cryo sleep process's rigors. Then, of course, the scientists patiently explained the contents and purpose of each shot and how the substance did what they said it would. He turned to Dr. Franklin and said, "Maybe we should put this information on a learning tape, too."
"Perhaps we will, my boy, perhaps we will. Time for bed, my boy."
Dr. Franklin motioned to what looked like a glass coffin. David got into the coffin, and the scientists closed the lid and started the process. David could smell something like coffee and wanted to tell Dr. Franklin that this was unfair since he had no breakfast. The next thing David knew was that he was freezing. Someone had left the window open, and it must be snowing outside. Man, it was cold. Then, in the distance, David heard a familiar voice.
"David, my boy, how are you feeling?"
David tried to remember who this voice belonged to. But it was too hard, so he simply allowed himself to drift off to sleep. After a while, David came up again. This time, he opened his eyes. He could see all kinds of people around him, all saying something, then that same voice again.
"David, my boy, how are you feeling?"
"Oh, Doc, it's cold as you know what down here." David tried to reply, but all that came out was, "Caw caw cold."
"Oh well, that's to be expected, my boy. Can you move?"
David thought a bit and tried. It was hard. It was exhausting, but he moved and got out of the coffin with a lot of help. Then he was helped to a seat and a cup of hot coffee. That reminds me, Doc, I smelled coffee just as I settled down in the coffin. Dr. Franklin replied,
That was an anesthetic. We thought you might like the smell of coffee. And we don't call it a coffin. We call it the cryo chamber.
David thought momentarily and asked, how long was I out?
Well, David my boy, it was just the 2 days we had scheduled. Now we go back to the testing and medical exams to see how you fit. But first, we get you warmed up, fed, and rested.
That, it seems, was that. Again, the Air Force flight surgeons prodded and poked David until it was ridiculous. X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, echograms of every description, and again, the Air Force proclaimed David fit as a fiddle. Then came the tests, this time only astrophysics. But it seemed to David that they had made the test easier. When Dr. Franklin debriefed him, he was told that he had learned the first 4 semesters of astrophysics in the 2 days he had been out. The next question was answered when he was introduced to the Taekwondo instructor. It seemed that David had learned Taekwondo. The instructor tested David repeatedly and awarded him a green belt in the art of Taekwondo. David worked with the scientists every day, Monday through Friday, and then in the evening, he would train in Taekwondo for 2 hours. On the weekends, David was allowed to follow his own pursuits, except that he was prohibited from leaving Area 51. After several months, David found himself alone again. The problem was he was a senior sergeant. The younger enlisted personnel would have little social contact with him. Still, he was an enlisted man, so the officers were aloof. The other senior sergeants were all Air Force, so David found himself in his BEQ room, alone more and more. David dreamed of his family and missed his Phyllis so very much. Nothing seemed to help the ache in his heart and soul except work. Then, one day, as he was walking to the NCO club for dinner, he heard a gentle voice.
Sergeant Major, how are you getting along here at Green Lake?
David turned and looked around. The only person near him was the attractive sergeant who played flight attendant on his trip here. I'm sorry, Sergeant, were you talking to me?
Yes, I was. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine, and how are you?
Standard reply.
She returned.
I'm fine too. Now that we both have lied to each other, tell me the truth, how are you?
David looked down. I'm really fine, he told the ground. The sergeant touched his cheek.
You're fine, except?
She stepped a little closer and whispered in his ear.
Except a little lonely.
Yeah, I guess you've got it. Sergeant Stella Black looked at the tall, good-looking Army Sergeant Major.
Will you join me for dinner this evening?
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure.
With that, the two walked side by side to the NCO club and had dinner. Coming the other way was a major. Stella snapped him a salute as they walked on. Suddenly, they heard the major shout.
Sergeant Major, don't you salute officers?
David turned and addressed the officer. Yes, sir. But I usually wait for them to salute me first, but then I'm not as chicken as an officer. The major began to turn red with anger, but David simply pointed to his chest, to a light blue ribbon with 5 white stars. The major started.
The Medal of Honor. My apologies, Sergeant Major.
Then the major saluted David, and David returned that salute. Both turned and went on their way. Stella saluted David.
I'm sorry, Sergeant Major.
David smiled. As I told the major, I'm not as chicken as an officer. Then, they walked to the NCO club. The dinner was Dutch, but the company and conversation helped to while away the time. Before they knew it, it was time to close the club, so they said a cheerful goodnight and parted company. David dreamed of Sergeant Stella Black that night. Her soft voice called to him across the distance between them.
David, time to get out of bed. Come on now my boy, time to rise and shine. We've another trial starting today.
Dr. Franklin called him. It was 4 a.m. and time to shower and dress for today's cryo nap. Again, no breakfast. As the two arrived at the lab, David got his briefing from Dr. Franklin.
This time my boy, we will continue the taekwondo training. We might add a little boxing, perhaps some savate. But we shall include more astrophysics and some math, okay my boy?
Well, that sounded okay with David. This trial would last a week, 7 days. Well, if it was anything like last time, it was over before it began, at least for him. The week's trial went as planned. He awoke to the cold but came away from the test feeling as good as new. The examinations by the Air Force doctors again pronounced him in excellent health. He took the test reviewing his knowledge of astrophysics and math. He was also awarded his first-degree black belt in Taekwondo. Further exercises confirmed that he had the skills of a boxer and a French foot fighter. Dr. Franklin was beside himself with joy at the outcome of David's test results. The first evening after his awakening from the week's test, David was on his way to the NCO club when he happened upon Sergeant Black. She seemed to be waiting for someone. David greeted her lightly and asked if she was waiting for someone.
Yes, I am.
She replied.
I have been waiting for you.
For me?
Yes, for you. I've been waiting here every evening this past week. I was really hoping to see you again.
She confessed.
I really liked your company the other evening.
They walked into the club and sat for dinner.
Sergeant Major.
Stella began. David interrupted. Please, call me David. At least while we are having dinner together.
Okay, I was going to ask you if I could call you David. David.
May I ask you a rather personal question, Stella? She smiled and answered.
You may ask, but I may not answer if that's okay with you.
Well, I'm kinda curious. Why did you? Why were you? Well, that night. David's voice trailed off to an embarrassed silence. Stella saw that this was awkward for him.
Why did I approach you last time? Why was I waiting for you this week?
Yeah, was all that would come out of his mouth.
David, I could see that you were alone. And I was lonely, too. You were someone I had at least some reason to speak to. And you are the only passenger I have ever had that thanked me after the plane landed. You just seem to be a nice guy. I wanted to get to know you.
David studied her and replied, I was lonely. But I never thought someone like you would ever be lonely. I thought your calendar would be filled months in advance. Stella looked at him seriously.
Why didn't you ask me for a date when you got off the airplane?
Well, I was the new guy and army at that. You have been here a while, and you're Air Force. You're lovely and nice and young. I am older, and I thought you might laugh at me. Like I said, I thought your calendar would be filled months in advance. Stella stuck her chin out and defiantly said.
That's what every guy thinks. It's the plain Janes that get all the guys. They're not intimidating. That's why I decided to take matters into my own hands and take the initiative. I wanted to get to know you. I know it's not ladylike. But then, being ladylike has not gotten me very many dates since high school.
Their dinner came, and they fell into a clumsy silence. David spoke quietly. I'm sorry, Stella. I'm really glad you did what you did. I really like your company. It kinda makes an old sergeant feel a little younger. She smiled and said.
You're not old, just mature.
With that, they both laughed and dug into their meals. Later that evening, as they walked in the warm Nevada air, David tentatively reached out for Stella's hand, and without a word, her hand slipped into his. It seemed so natural. Stella asked David.
Where were you this past week?
You know I am involved in a classified project with Dr. Franklin. I have an assignment that puts me out of contact for various periods. It's just part of the job. She regarded him silently, then.
Will you let me know when you will be gone?
Stella, I'll let you know when I will disappear. And for about how long? That's the best I can do. Stella looked very unhappy. But she agreed that under the circumstances, it would have to do. Upon reaching her barracks, they turned and faced each other, holding hands like two teenagers. David bent slowly to kiss her. But she turned her head and gently said,
Let's not spoil the evening.
Sorry. Please forgive me. I'm very sorry. David's ears turned bright red, and he turned, good night. And straightening, he walked briskly away. She stood momentarily watching him walk away and then turned and entered her barracks. A small voice told her that a tiny kiss should have been all right as she sat at her desk. She pushed the thought aside and prepared for the night. David marched briskly away until he was out of sight of her barracks, then he slowed and went on, not the heroic soldier but the whipped dog, tail between his legs. Finally, at the Bic, he showered and turned in for the night. The next day, he worked on the computer systems in the project lab at a pace that no one else could match. At the usual quitting time, David stayed at work until well past 1900 hours. He thought he would probably miss her as he left the lab and headed for the NCO club. He entered the club, took a back booth, and had a quiet dinner. When he finished eating and was about to go to his room, Stella came and sat across the table.
Where have you been?
I had to work late, sorry.
I waited for you. You should have called me.
Stella, I have to tell you the truth. I was so embarrassed about last night, I really didn't want to face you.
I thought so. It was just a little mistake. Please don't let it ruin our friendship. I really like you as a friend.
Well, I wasn't really looking forward to eating alone. But it seemed preferable to facing you after my faux pas. I really like you too.
There, see, facing it wasn't so bad, now was it?
Stella, I am a combat soldier. I faced death in Vietnam. But that was a whole lot easier than facing you. I guess I'm a bit of a coward when it comes to a relationship kind of thing.
At this point, I need to pause. Who does this young woman think she is? She doesn't own David. They're only acquaintances. And David, is he a wimp? If it weren't for what happens later, I would stop writing.
Well, just don't let it happen again. Okay.
I will do my best to be on my good behavior and to face up to my mistakes.
Dave, would you like to dance?
I have never danced in my life.
Well, I'll teach you. Come on.
After a bit of coaxing, David and Stella stepped out onto the dance floor, and she began to teach him a few basic waltz steps. She was a patient teacher, and he wasn't as clumsy as he thought he would be. After a while, he seemed to catch on to the rhythm and moves of the waltz, and then she moved in a little closer, and they really danced. He was mesmerized by her closeness and the music. The sweet smell of her seemed to fog his brain and senses. He suggested that they get a little fresh air. They left the club, and he walked her to her barracks. This time, he wished her a good night and promised to meet her at her billets for dinner and maybe a movie. She agreed and stepped into the building. David's head spun as he slowly walked to the BEQ. He was glad that his trying to kiss her wasn't as bad a mistake as he thought. But now, what kind of relationship could he hope for, being hopelessly infatuated with her? As he climbed into bed, his last thought was, oh well, I take what I can get. At least I can be near her. Work went as usual. David took in every aspect of the project, almost to the point of memorizing reams of notes, schematics, specifications, and theories. Each evening, David met Stella for dinner and dancing, a movie, or just a walk. They talked about 1,000 different things. But both carefully avoided talking about their relationship. Finally, he told her that he would be away for a month. He would be going the next Monday. Again, she didn't look too happy about that. But she knew the demands of duty, so they, again, took a walk in the warm Nevada evening. As they walked, she took his hand, and they walked along, talking about nothing special. Soon, they came upon her barracks and stopped. She turned to face him, still holding his hand.
I'll miss you.
He looked at her, knowing that he would go into cryosleep and not be aware of the passage of time. But he decided to lie a little. I'll miss you, too. I just can't imagine eating alone again. That is sheer torture. She agreed, turned abruptly, and stepped into her building, leaving him to walk to his room alone. Monday morning, no breakfast, Dr. Franklin arrived to take him to the lab. Everything was ready again. Dr. Franklin gave him his usual briefing. They would give him electronics engineering, chemistry, physics, karate, jiu-jitsu, taekwondo, kung fu, shabbat, and boxing this time. Dr. Franklin went on to tell David that after this test, it would be about 6 months before they would begin the next phase of the project.
With that amount of time, you might just get to know that nice young sergeant you've been spending time with.
Said Dr. Franklin.
Stella Black, isn't it?
David stammered. How did you know?
David, my boy, this is a very small community, everyone knows about you too. I'm happy for you, my boy. A girlfriend is good as long as you remember that she is not cleared for our project. Now, it's time to go to sleep, my boy.
Afterward, David and Stella spent many happy hours together. Work and play filled the months. After about 3 months, David was determined to tell Stella he loved her. He had made up his mind to tell her after dinner that night. As he worked, the secretary called him to the phone.
David, this is Stella. I'm sorry, I won't be able to have dinner with you tonight. My boyfriend just returned from the Middle East, and I need to spend time with him. Okay.
He felt the world drop away from him. Yeah, okay. Have fun. His mind spun. Boyfriend? Boy, am I a fool? I guess it was just too good to be true. Sure glad I didn't make a jerk of myself this time. After work, he went to the club as usual. He spotted Stella and a nice-looking young sergeant sitting in one corner, looking into each other's eyes, holding hands and talking. Passing without their notice, he chose a table in a dark corner and ordered a small meal. After a short time, Stella and her friend approached his table. She introduced them.
David, this is my boyfriend, Bobby, Robert Klein. Bobby, this is Sergeant Major David Stevens.
Bobby didn't look too happy. But he was civil. David indicated that they should sit. Then he turned to Robert and said, "You don't look too happy. Is there something wrong, Bob?" He shot a quick glance at Stella and said,
"Yeah, I don't like guys that try to beat my time with my girl."
"Bob, look at me. I am twice her age. I could be her father, for crying out loud. We were just two people who needed a little company to help pass the off-duty time. I'm no competition for you. The relationship Stella and I have is more father and daughter than anything else." David took a $50 bill from his wallet and handed it to Bobby. "Here, you two have fun." Bob answered,
"We don't need your money."
"Look, I'm a sergeant major and a bachelor. You, two young sergeants, don't make near what I do. Take this and have fun on me, okay?" Bobby looked greatly relieved, thanked him for watching over her, and took the money. Stella looked at David with an odd expression and then smiled, and the two young sergeants left David sitting alone. David arose, went to his room, and wondered if he would even find a little happiness again. David drove himself relentlessly, working 12, 16 hours a day, trying to fill the hours with work so as not to think about Phyllis or Stella. Every night, he ate alone. Quickly, efficiently, rarely tasting his food. He only ate to fuel his body. There was little to no enjoyment. Several weeks went by, crawling by at a snail's pace. He even began to avoid the places where he and Stella had once spent such happy hours together. He rarely ate in the NCO club, preferring the mess hall or BX snack bar. And he avoided the library, theater, swimming pool, skating rink, and the area near her barracks. The pain in his soul seemed to grow each day. He grew lonelier and lonelier. He had gone to the club one evening to have a late snack. About 200 hours or 2 a.m., he walked back to the BEQ. When he entered his room, it was not as dark as expected. Sitting in the chair at the desk was Stella, quietly weeping. He stepped around and put his hand on her shoulder. She started and looked up.
"Oh David, I didn't know where to turn. Bobby and I have broken up."
She stood, stepped closer, and put her head on his shoulder.
"Bobby told me that he had fallen in love with another girl while he was in the Middle East.
I'm sorry. I wish I could do something for you."
He said that he had not realized that he only came back to me out of a sense of loyalty. But, after being with me, he recognized it and thought it best to be honest with me.
He had his arms around her and softly patted her back, being very uncomfortable because he really didn't know how to deal with a woman's tears. The room was filled with silence, broken only by her gentle sobs. He held her for nearly a half hour. As her crying slowed, he helped her sit again. She looked at him and wiped her eyes.
"I'm sorry to do this to you. I just didn't know where to turn. You are my best friend, and I needed your strong arms."
He just looked at her, not knowing what to say. Then, in a raspy voice, he said, "That's okay. What are friends for?" The next day was Saturday, so there was no need to go to bed anytime soon. They sat up and talked until it was growing light out. Finally, she said she thought she should get some sleep. David rose to walk her to her barracks. But as he helped her to her feet, she rose, stepped closer, and put her head on his shoulder again.
"David, could we have breakfast together?"
"Yeah, shall we go to the mess hall?"
"No, let's go to the snack bar. There'll be fewer people there."
They walked to the snack bar, and as they went, he took her hand in his and simply walked close to her side. She did not resist this sign of affection but gave his hand a slight squeeze while giving him a little smile. He was confused. But as he once said, "I'll take anything I can get." After breakfast, he walked her to her barracks and watched as she entered and closed the door. He went on to his room and then decided to get some sleep. Sleep came, but not before his heart expressed a hope that he might have a slight chance. Then his mind told him, "Remember, you're an old man. You haven't a chance with her. With that comforting thought, he drifted off to a restless sleep. He awoke to someone knocking at his door. He scratched his head, yawned, and called, "Come in." When the door opened, there she was. She looked rested and well-groomed.
I've come to take you to dinner.
What time is it, anyway?
It's 5:30.
Oh, let me shower and change. I don't want to go anywhere in these clothes.
Shall I wait for you out in the lobby?
No. I'll take my pants in the bathroom. With that, he took his underwear and a pair of pants into the bathroom, took his shower, shaved, and did the things a man does in the morning. Finally, he dressed and realized that he had forgotten his shirt. Oh well, she'd seen him without a shirt before. She turned and looked at him when he stepped out of the bathroom. Her face had an odd expression as she moved around a chair and up close to him. He reached the dresser to get his shirt when she put her arms around him and her head on his chest.
I've always liked hairy men,
she said as she pressed her cheek to him. He was bewildered now. But he slid his arms around her and held her gently. She turned her face up and looked into his eyes. He knew better but slowly bent down and kissed her very gently.
Oh, David, do that again.
And he did. Stella, I will probably regret what I am going to say next, but I have to. I love you so very much.
David, I realized after you left me at my barracks that I was only being loyal to Bobby. I just now understood that I have really fallen in love with you.
Oh, the joy of discovery. They stood and held each other for a long time. Then, finally, David said, I think we had better get something to eat.
I think you're right.
He bent again and kissed her.
Oh David, do that again.
And he did. They sat the next Monday evening at the NCO club. He looked at her and said, Honey, in about a month, I will be away for almost a year. Will you wait for me? Stella regarded David for a long moment and replied,
David darling, I'll wait as long as I must to be with you.
Well then, David stood up and walked around the table to where she sat. Then, slowly knelt beside her chair, he took her hand and looked into her eyes. Stella, at the end of this next phase of the project, he pulled a small diamond ring from his pocket. Will you marry me? Tears welled up in her eyes.
Oh yes, yes. I will gladly marry you.
He slipped the ring on her finger. If you don't like this one, we'll go to the base exchange tomorrow and get one you like. She held up her hand and admired the ring.
I love it, I love it. It is the most beautiful ring in the world. David dear, you have excellent taste.
With that, the happy couple stood together and danced. The month went by fast. Again, it was 4 a.m., and David was getting ready for the day. Then, Dr. Franklin knocked at his door and stood. Well, David, my boy, are you ready? Just about. He was finishing getting his uniform on when another knock came at the door. David opened the door to let Stella into the room. She turned to Dr. Franklin and said,
Dr. Franklin, may I have a few minutes, please?
The doctor smiled and stepped to.
15 minutes, my boy.
She put her arms around his neck and looked into his eyes.
I promise I'll wait. But we're getting married as soon as you get back. Okay.
You bet. And he kissed her.
Oh David, do that again.
And he did. As they stood, the 15 minutes flew by. Dr. Franklin knocked.
My boy, it's time.
He'll be right there.
She smiled.
I want to give you an incentive to come back to me as soon as possible.
With that, she unbuttoned and opened her blouse. She was not wearing a bra. David caught his breath. You're so beautiful. I'll come back as soon as I can. I love you. She buttoned her blouse, and they walked out hand in hand and kissed and parted.
Second Chances, Chapter 5.